All right, we are back for episode 67 of Digital Divination. Jason, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm It's been a really good week overall. Great weather and not
Mhm.
too much work and just,
That's good, that's
good.
good.
Yeah, yeah.
Since the last time we recorded,
Mhm.
something came out on television that is my one of my absolute most favoriteest things that I have watched now, in a long time. It is I'm gonna tell you what it is. I'm not gonna keep you in suspense much longer.
Okay, yeah. I'm
It
trying to
is
think.
the
Trying to think.
No, you wouldn't know. You might not know about this. It's the TV series for the old web series, Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. Now, this has nothing to do with Starfinder,
Oh,
or anything like that. You know, it's puppets and a little bit of creepy horror and British humor and that kind of stuff. So, um, if it hits a certain niche configuration of things that I like, and it finally came out. It's been in the works for years now,
mhm.
and it came out, and I watched it all last weekend, and I loved it.
Good.
Yeah.
That's great. Did you
I've
binge watch like
been
whole series?
Yes, I watched. There's only 6 episodes. It's a British series, so it's
Oh,
only
okay.
6 episodes, and I've been
Yeah.
rewatching them actually in the past week too.
Yeah.
So I have been, basically keeping up on that, just sort of watching them and rewatching them and watching videos about them on YouTube on, theories and reviews and that sort of thing.
Mhm, mhm. Well,
Yeah.
great. Well, I've started watching we started watching the, House of the Dragon.
Okay.
I don't know if you've watched any of that. So it's the
I haven't watched
prequel
that
to
one.
Game of
Yeah.
Thrones, and then we caught up with that. So then we
Okay.
started watching Andor as well,
Mhm.
which is kind of another prequel, but Star Wars,
Yeah.
and we started watching, The Rings of Power, which is the Lord of the Rings prequel, and so it's we like to watch 1 or 2 different shows in the evening,
Yeah.
different
Right.
series, and, usually we will watch something that's been out for a while, and so we can just continue with that, but
Right.
because we've kind of watched everything we wanted to watch, now we're watching newer things, and it's confusing my wife is what's
Oh, no.
is because they're like, "Ah, this is a fantasy one, and then this is kind of a space fantasy one, and then this is
Yeah.
another fantasy one, and what was happening in this one?" And,
Mm.
for me, it's, "Oh, yeah, it's fine. I can tell what keeping track of stuff."
Yeah, yeah.
And for her, she's not super into fantasy and stuff.
Okay,
It's a little
yeah.
bit I find that, okay, I need to remind her about this thing or this thing. Um, but I was gonna say, out of the 3 of those, so House of the Dragon, Andor, and, the Rings of
Rings of
Power,
Power.
I'm liking Rings of Power the best right now.
All right. Okay. You've mentioned there's 3 series I have not watched yet, and we'll
Okay.
most likely get to Rings of Power soon. Probably watch Andor as well. I'm on the fence about House of the Dragon.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, I hear you, I hear you. It's, House of the Dragon, quite frankly, has not been very good in
Oh no.
the fact that we're into so tonight will be episode 7. We're at
Mhm.
7 to 10. We'll finish it. It's not
Yeah.
that
Sure.
bad. Um, there was another Amazon series out there called Tokyo Vice that was out there, and
I
we got
heard about
all the
that.
way to the final episode, and it was, like, so bad,
Oh no.
we didn't watch the final episode. We went 9s and we I just can't stand the writing, the story, how they're going about things. Said, "Fine, we're not even gonna see how it ends. We don't care." It wrecked
Sure.
it for us.
Yeah.
So,
Well, sometimes
give me
it's okay to give up on a TV
yeah,
show or a book or whatever.
yeah, yeah. Well, I it was a tough call early on. There was some intriguing stuff, and then it just kinda ran out of juice.
Yeah. I got
But
it.
this kind of this topic of these, series that we've been looking at
Yeah.
actually reminds me of something I'd like to talk about for today.
All right.
So
It's
I did.
it's we didn't plan this either, by the way.
Okay. No,
That's a
no,
great
no.
segue, John. It's a great segue. We didn't plan it,
Oh,
so I love it.
I'm working on it. I'm working it. I'm working it.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, something that Ron and I did, probably a couple years ago by now is,
Mhm.
we had gone through kind of the AP process from his point of view, which was for Pathfinder Second
Right.
Edition Adventure Paths. And I was thinking, now that I have somebody who's done this for Starfinder,
Mhm.
that we should do this for Starfinder. And I'm really curious to kind of see the differences and how you go through from ideation of a
Mhm.
particular adventure path all the way to the, kind of the final conclusion, whatever that may end up being.
Yeah.
So,
Go ahead, yeah.
oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say the process probably isn't that much different than a Pathfinder one because they all sort of came out of the same uh, company, the same process essentially, right? The
Right, right, right.
and the original group of people who worked on the Starfinder stuff are from the Pathfinder AP land, right? Rob McCreary, basically, probably did a lot of work on the Pathfinder APs from first edition, and then when he moved over to Starfinder, just kind of moved the process over in the same way, and it's a process that basically works. I'm sure we have a lot of it's altered, changed a little bit. It's probably diverged in the interim since second edition has come out a little bit here and there. So it'll be interesting to hear if I say anything that's completely different than what you and Ron talked about.
Okay. Well, I know that there's one thing that was probably different in that Starfinder went to the 3-volume APs first.
Oh yeah.
Now, Pathfinder Second Edition's kind of gone to that. So that's probably one thing I'm kind of curious about how that worked as well. But
Hmm.
yeah, how do you come up with the ideas? I have a sense for how it works, but I don't know.
I mean, it comes down to someone is going to be the lead developer for an adventure path. That's chosen by schedules and project management and whatever. This is the person who's going to do it. And there's probably a little bit of like, make sure talking to the person, you're going to be doing this. Oh, right. Okay. Yes, you're going to be doing this. And so that person is basically kind of gets in charge of the brainstorming of it all, uh, coming up with a general idea. Most likely, talking with other members of the team, people who have maybe a bit more view of things. When creative director might be there, sort of like, oh no, we're we're thinking about doing this book, and maybe something that ties into this hardcover. Um, that didn't really come out until sort of more recent APs, I would say,
Mhm.
especially the ones on the Pathfinder side. They would try to tie in some hardcovers, but in the beginning, it was mainly just like, okay, what kind of story can we tell that will be a cool adventure, B, sort of highlight something about the setting, C, maybe introduce a cool subsystem that we want to have, hit some kind of I don't want to say marketing goal, but hit some sort of sales goal in the sort of way. I'm like, oh, we haven't yet done, when we were looking at high level APs, we haven't done any high level stuff yet. Probably now's a good time. Let's figure out what kind of story works
Mhm.
for that. So, depending on who's in charge of things and what Paizo sort of needs at the time, what Starfinder needs at the time, sort of directs the brainstorming. At the beginning, though, it was pretty wide open.
Yeah, so one of the things that Ron mentioned, and I'm curious to see if it's similar for Starfinders, he talked about kind of everybody being in the big conference room
Hmm.
and people kind of throwing out different ideas. Oh, let's do a western, let's do a whatever, let's do whatever. Um, you know, at that point for Pathfinder, rather than whoever the developer at the time was, because you would alternate the two main
Hmm.
AP developers would alternate who developed in the main part and then who developed the back matter, right? Kind of flip
Yeah,
flop.
basically,
Is
yeah,
that
yeah.
yeah? Okay. And,
That's altered now too as well,
right.
but
I
by now,
understood,
but in the
but
beginning, yeah.
initially, yeah. And so he kind of mentioned that rather than having the developers working on something, everybody was kind of like throwing things around. Is that different than Starfinder?
No, often it would come down to the main person being like pitching a couple ideas of stuff they would be excited about,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And then just sort of working on. um, somewhere early on in the life of Starfinder, we made a big list of AP
Right, right.
ideas. It's sort of like it was a lot of like quick bullet point ideas like swarm war. We think we wrote Kingmaker in space on that one at some point.
Mhm.
Stuff about the setting. Like dragon corporations, something about that. It would just be like a phrase at most.
Right,
And when it came time to when it would come time to brainstorm the next AP, a lot of people would grab that list and sort of like, oh, we haven't done this
right.
yet. We haven't done this yet. Is this too similar to what we just did? I don't know. Let's just sort of what am I most excited about? And then I mean that's the reason why the third AP is space horror, because
Right.
that's the one I pitched and that's what I was excited to do, right?
Mhm, mhm.
So we sort of lean towards it. Generally, I think it's going to be a better product overall if the person who's the lead developer is excited about the story and
Right.
excited about what what they want to do. So we sort of basically would go in those directions. If someone was like, "Oh, this is what I would do," it's the same with Jake's first AP. He presented three things, and he was like, "This is the one I'm most excited about." And Rob and I were like, "Sure, let's do it. We love it. It sounds great. You look like you thought about it a
Right,
little bit. You want to do the space trucker thing? It's not a niche we've hit yet. I
right.
think it'll resonate with people. We can add a little subsystem in there, all that kind of stuff that you're excited about. And often it can be kind of an easy sell for the general idea, right?
Mhm, mhm.
When it comes down to the specifics, when you get down to the nitty gritty of, what's volume one, what's volume two, et cetera, that gets a little more, those meetings get a little longer, a little
Mhm.
more detailed. And oftentimes, sort of in the beginning, it was very much, well, Starfinder was a small team. So yeah, we kind of all talked about the APs. And then kind
Mhm.
of Starfinder got a little bigger. And then there was the AP team just deciding on their own stuff and letting the hardcover team kind of know what was going on. And then sort of more recently, a little bit during the pandemics times, the isolation times, the work at home times. It kind of broadened again to sort of like, well, what do we all think about this idea? Let's hash it out. What do we?
So so Rob is the creative director at the time, and you had
Yeah.
the final say on, when Fly Free or Die was being decided upon? Or does Eric Mona actually you have to bring it to him
Yeah,
still?
yeah, that did have to be have to be brought up to Eric at some point.
Mhm.
It was just sort of what we get the exciting idea first, right?
Right.
Jake's excited about Fly Free or Die. That sounds great. Rob likes the idea, Fly Free or Die. You probably just sort of quickly pitch it to Eric during one of the sort of managerial type meetings,
Right.
and
Right,
or
right.
just let everyone know this is what we're doing next. Sounds great. Eric, I never really got a ton of found that there was a ton of pushback from Eric on specifics of
Right.
things when it came to Starfinder. At any rate, I think
Mhm.
since Pathfinder all has been and kind of probably always will be the sort of main flagship brand, he probably has a little more to say about
Right. 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 Right.
specifics where they're going here and there. But once we've decided on the main thing, we kind of bring it back to the nitty gritty. Lead developer will write up an outline, right? Or at least
Mhm.
start writing an outline, or hitting some of the main sort of story beats. What might go on each of the volumes, and at that point, other brainstorming will need to happen between lead developer, the developer of the back matter, the creative director. So maybe another couple other people. We try to keep that small because
Right.
brainstorming sessions with too many people get too broad, too much in a way. And then we throw ideas around. What if this happened? What if we get from point A? How do we get from point A to point B? That would be a sort of thing. It's like, I know where I want it to begin and I know where I want it to end. What happens in
Right.
the middle? When it was 6 volume APs, it was trickier to do, right?
Right.
Talking about the Swarm War,
Mhm.
right, the one, Attack of the Swarm. It was like, okay, this is a war one. We want to do Attack of the Swarm, but got to start off. And I was like, I knew from the beginning, I want to start off on a planet that we can wreck, just totally
Right.
wreck. And
Right.
the first 2 volumes are basically about running away in a lot of ways, sort of being pushed back.
Mhm.
It's an overwhelming force. What do you do? And then, of course, at the end, I was like, well, then we take back the planet. But then there was what happens in the middle. And a lot of times, I got to say, whether or not this sort of is a byproduct of sort of coming from a lot of us did work in Pathfinder, and a lot of us are sort of semi more familiar with um, fantasy adventures or just those sorts of adventures in general, it always came down to a thing. There was a thing you had to get, an object, a MacGuffin, so to speak, right?
Right.
That would help you defeat A or the bad guy, or give you the powers to get to where the bad guy is, or unlock something good. That's why in Attack of the Swarm, there's the Crown of Hylax, and I'm spoiling the Attack of the Swarm a little bit here. At some
I
point, you
played
get a
it,
big
so it's
crown.
okay.
That's fair. You've played it. There's at some point you get a mystical
Yeah.
crown that helps you sort
Yeah.
of basically do a thing that busts, sort of allows you to attack the swarm back and get to the heart
Right.
of it and rescue the planet where you came from, that you were driven
Hmm.
off in the first volume. Sometimes it's finding a place, getting to it, like Dawn of Flame. Sometimes it's
Right.
just sort of a mystery. Threefold Conspiracy has a lot of mysteries in it. Same with Fly Free or Die ends up being sort of a revenge story by the end of it.
Right.
And how do you get revenge? So some of them aren't, but early on in the beginning, it was Dead Sons was about the stellar degenerator, right? And
Right.
and this MacGuffin of a super weapon. Um, Against the Aeon Throne kind of ended up being sort of also a MacGuffin that you had to get away from the Aslanti, so they couldn't have it.
Uh,
And a lot of these things, it doesn't really matter what the MacGuffin is. You just need to figure out a reason for it to be important, right?
hmm hmm
Um, so yeah, hashing things out. So we hash things out. We have probably several meetings, and it would be like an hour, hour and a half long. And be like, okay, well, we'll put a pin in it here. We'll come back tomorrow, or when everyone else is free. It's always the scheduling problems, right?
Right.
Um, Eventually, though, you get to a point where the lead developer can fully write the outline, right? Somewhere along the lines, it doesn't happen first, but somewhere along the lines, titles are thought about, and we have lists of
Right.
titles for each volume, right? But that
Right.
generally titles come from what happens in the adventure, right?
hmm hmm
Um, though, fun fact about me is sometimes I will write a title, then decide that from there decide what happens in the adventure.
Yeah.
I've done that a couple times when I like the sound of this title. What does that mean? I don't know. Let's figure out
Yeah.
what it means for the adventure, right? And it's sort of good for it's a sort of for Horizons of the Vast. I kind of wrote some of those titles early on,
hmm
and then I had an idea of the general scope of the whole thing, but I kind of wrote some of the titles and been like, "Ooh, it's a real I want it pulpy or something
hmm
title." Um, and uh, the same thing with one of the Attack of the Swarm volumes. I somewhere noticing that Hylax was called the Forever Queen, and then I thought of the phrase "the Forever Reliquary," which to me
Right.
sounds like the most Doctor Who episode that title that I could have ever come up with of my own.
Okay.
And so from there, I was like, okay, what does that mean? I don't know. We've got to figure that out. But most of the times, you just you skeleton the plot out for the most part, and
hmm
then write the titles. And then this is a little more where Eric Mona gets involved. He's a little more uh,
Hmm.
nice to know what the titles are going to be ahead of time, right? And the same with the title of the AP in general too, right? And it can be quite contentious, but it can sometimes you get stuck and you're just like, oh, that doesn't sound quite right. That title doesn't sound quite right. Or for the whole thing, you want something that's punchy and fun. Um,
Right.
can't tell you of something. There's a title that's coming that we decided on like early, like a couple months before I left for an AP that's coming that I think is great. And it was kind of like there was a lot going back and forth because there's reasons for why we couldn't use certain titles because of other uh what's the word I'm looking for, IPs,
Right.
titles of other
Right. Right. Right.
things that
That makes
exist in
sense.
the role playing game universe.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it ended up becoming a thing, and this is a title that Jenny Jarzabski came up with, and it was like, no, this is it, we got it. And then she kind of was like, oh, I'm not 100% sure. I had to like be like, no, 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 it's great, it's great. You came up with something that's great. Don't double
Yeah.
guess yourself. That's not the word. What's the word? Like second guess
Second
yourself.
guess. Yeah.
Don't second guess yourself on this. You've come up with a fun title, and people are gonna love it. So keep an eye out for that one.
Right.
I'll
So,
we'll
so I have
talk
a
about
couple.
it when it comes out because I'm curious about how that's going to end up.
Yeah. Kind of speaking of that,
Mhm.
timing. So, if something is coming out in right after Gen Con, say we have a
Sure.
Gen Con release for a new AP or
Yeah.
Gen Con of 2023,
Mhm.
when do you start brainstorming that AP?
Generally, about a year earlier than that. around summer of 2022, basically what happens. Yeah, I remember that sort of thinking about what the next one would come out. And actually, the one we, the one I was just talking about that I can't really talk about, is probably not going to come out until kind of October of 2023. So
Right.
sometimes it's
Right.
over a year. Um, that's so we can have a good couple of weeks up to a month of the outlining phase and figuring everything out because there's a lot of pieces in an AP, and you want to get it right ahead of time because the less you sort of figure out first, the more difficult the job becomes later on. So, which I'll get to. Um, and then you got to give time for authors to write these books. It's a lot of words. You want to give people enough time, and then you got to have enough time to develop them and uh, 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 figure out what the art is early enough so that we order the art in time for that it exists for when layout is happening. So that is a push and pull that has been constant, I would say, because it's difficult to order art for something you don't know what's in it, i.e., you haven't developed it yet, really, or what,
Hmm.
but with schedules being what they are, you kind of need to order that early enough. So sometimes you're ordering art for a thing that's not completely developed and finished, and in some ways, you end up sort of like, oh, this, oh, I know this, I can see this NPC looking through the author's turnover or whatever. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, sorry. But
Yeah.
scheduling wise, that's how it works. But you might see something, then you write it, say, oh, let's order this art, and then when you develop it, you're like, oh, wait, I don't want that. I don't like that NPC anymore. Or, that NPC doesn't
Right.
work, or it contradicts something that goes on. And
Mm-hmm.
but you've ordered art for it, and it's been paid for, so you kind of have to use it. But that's the
That's
reality of some of these
yeah.
situations.
Yeah.
Um, Once the outline has been written, rewind a little bit. Eric has approved of all the titles, and we find authors, right? Um,
How long is that outline?
that outline. Oh, that's a good question. I can remember. Those outlines can be quite long. Um, I want to say 30 pages.
Okay.
It is an endeavor to write an outline of for an AP, especially even a short 3-volume one. Um, a lot of those pages are boilerplate stuff. If you've ever written an outline for Paizo, you might say that it's like, here's what's expected of you as the author.
Hmm.
Here's your code of conduct. Um, what's going to happen after you've turned it in? But a chunk of it is mainly a big chunk of background, right? What happened before the adventures began? What events lead to the adventures, so that everyone can read it and know what's going on. A small sort of cast of characters. Everyone writes outlines a little bit differently, I found too. But for the most part, we sort of have a template that's like, here's what's going on. Here's some people who are involved, and then here's a sort of brief summary of each of the volumes, and then we get into individual volumes and outlines, which are more detailed. And again, people write outlines differently. Sometimes you'll be this sort of like, real. I want this needs to happen. The PCs start here, they go here, they do this, they do that, and then it ends here. No real room for variation. Sometimes, for me, sometimes I'll be like, point A to point B. I don't know how they get there. Figure that out for me. Then
Hmm.
point B to point C is this exactly, but then point C is something you can come up with, or So the specifics of point C are, it's definitely an abandoned asteroid mining facility. I don't care what it looks like. You get to make, as an author, you get to populate it with monsters and whatnot. But we do give suggestions of monsters that are in about the level range for the adventure. We give some suggestions of, if you're going to write some monsters, hey, we'll give you 3 or 4 spaces to write new monsters. Um, at this time too, the other developer was this has changed a little bit, but would be also like, this is what we need to do for the back matter, and if that gets folded into the main outline, but it's just sort of really like, this will be an article about Desna, or this will be an article about chitons, or not chitons, sorry, Velstrax, or something like that, right? Or this place. This is a place that's going to be featured in the adventure. We need a gazetteer for it. Um, at this point, some beginning of this very year, 2022, is when we sort of switched over to what Pathfinder 2e was doing for a bit, which is a single developer develops and outlines and concepts an entire book, an entire adventure path, and works on it themselves. Um, each of the volumes of the adventure path. So while the other developer who's off is probably developing a standalone module or something else, right? Because had a lot going on there, or basically working on the next thing, right? Because we always
Right.
going to be working on basically the life of a developer, at least was essentially finishing the last thing, working on the current thing, and thinking about the next thing kind of all at the same time. And that would just whatever the thing is would just rotate. Yeah. You send out to authors. Basically, this is the part where, as a developer, you send it out to the authors to write. You might have some contact with them. You might create a Discord server, for instance, for them for authors to talk to one another and whatever. And there's some weeks about getting the contracts written and faking people. People might drop out, or getting the right combination of people. But that I feel like that's important to have a diverse range of voices when it comes to authors and that. So I would always be looking at the composition of who's writing what book and whatever. And then once that's off to the authors, that's the sort of spot where you're going back. Oh, let me finish the last thing. Oh, I've got to now make sure the last thing has been laid out, and I've got to copy fit it and or whatever. Um, and then you're on hold until they're done writing, right?
Can you give the authors 60 days or more?
I try to 60 days is for me. I think that's a little tight.
Okay.
I would try to give more, maybe closer to the thing is sometimes, and some developers do it differently. Is that um, if you're writing the last volume, you might have more time to do it. Some developers are like, no, everyone gets the same 60 to 90 days.
Mhm.
Everyone turns it in at the same time, even though that last volume isn't going to get developed for 6 months after it gets
Right.
turned in. No one's going to look at it, but some developers like to have it all at once. Maybe flip through all of it, right, and then to see whether the connective tissue needs to be sort of massaged and made. Um, I think it is nice to give that last person more time because that first person always gets like the least amount of time.
Right.
Um, it's not quite fair to the first person, but that's why the first person who gets to write the first volume of an AP has to be sort of like your superstar in a lot of ways. They can get it done. They get it done on time, and they do good work, so it doesn't take a ton of work to develop, et cetera, et cetera. So, uh, I think it's probably better to sort of move everyone to about the same timeline. If you can give everyone about the same amount of time, I think that's probably the fairest for everyone.
Right.
So it's out there. It's in the wild. It's being written. You're going to be getting milestones. You're going to be getting more detailed outlines, not in that order. But stuff to sort of give feedback to the author so they can finish and turn over a product that's done. And they give it to you, and their job is done. Hooray! Um, uh, until they get their contributor copy, essentially, right? Or if I might, developer might have questions. What did you mean by
Yeah.
this? Right? And then it gets developed, right, piece by piece. However, a developer does like to do that. Everyone has their own style of going from start to finish, working on the easy parts, and then sort of bouncing around, working on the hardest parts first, bouncing. And that takes time, lots of time. And in the process there, you're thinking about art, writing those art descriptions, those art's getting ordered, and then you're uh, finished with developing it. You hand it over to some editors. They get to read it and make sure it makes sense and polish it up to a delicious sheen. And then God, sheens are not delicious. I don't know what to a brilliant sheen. Sometimes when I'm talking like this, when I'm just sort of talking
Yeah.
extemporaneously, I will come up with the weirdest combination of words. But they polish it up. They'll come to you with questions. What did you mean by this? What did this mean? I've noticed that you've got 75% NPCs are male, and we should probably tweak that. Okay, great. Well, how do we make sure that is fair and equitable, and representative of what the real world is? As much
Yeah.
as we're talking about a science fantasy universe, it should be representative.
Mhm.
Once it, yeah,
I do have one question about art before we get too far along here.
sure.
So I've had a couple of things where art art description's been part of my turnover,
Hmm.
and then sometimes there'll be a blank there, but I'm not to do that part. That's the developer says we're gonna do that. What what determines that part of it? You want the author to provide a description or not?
I've moved away from asking that from authors because
Yep.
it's more work. They don't shouldn't have to think about these things. too much because it's not, they don't. It would have to explain um, how art gets sort of placed in, and which I'll sort of my philosophy on that sort of thing. Um, but in general, I think as an author, if you are writing things, if you're writing down people and places and whatever, and you're hopefully descriptive enough that as a developer, I can point out that's very interesting. I'm going to give that a piece of art. That doesn't stop an author from putting a little comment and saying, I mean, I really want to see this NPC
Mhm. Mhm.
illustrated, please, because it's based off of Luis's grandma or something. Um, uh, and uh, or if it's a new creature, whatever, there should be a physical
Yeah,
description of everything you're kind of have in your game, in your adventure. It
right.
should be described a little bit in ways that are visual, so that we can have art for it.
Mhm.
What I
Mhm.
do, what I used to do was put a little pagination, basically, sort of, this adventure gets 30 some pages in an Excel sort of spreadsheet, monster, 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 gazetteer page, whatever. And then sort of like, oh, there should be art every couple pages. There should be at least art, something like every, not quite every spread, maybe every 3 pages. And that's including the half page art. That's not including maps though. That's a sort of an extra thing. With
Right.
maps and sidebars and art about every 3 pages or so, it should be interesting to read and look at.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I sort of just sort of pace out, and then I kind of estimate where that is in the book, in the venture. Of course, there's certain things that are sort of de rigueur to illustrate. Someone you're going to fight, basically, right? We sort of do that. Oh, here's a weird, half centaur, half goblin, with a cybernetic face. Got to illustrate that. That comes around
Right.
about here
Right.
in the document, or this is an exciting scene where the PCs are sort of sneaking their way through an abandoned, video arcade. That'd be a fun half pager. Let's illustrate that. Um, uh, uh, Important NPCs, get a nice portrait. Anything that is an object, an artifact, something interesting that the PCs are going to get look at. That should have a spot illustration of what it is, right? Um, Back in the day, you'd also be thinking at that point, sort of like, okay, well, these are you illustrate the things that the people are going to fight because you're going to turn those illustrations into pawns. They don't really do
Right.
pawns. Paizo stopped doing pawns right about the beginning of this year, for every adventure path, because it was time consuming and a little more costly probably than what it was returning. Handy to have, but now we sort of maybe are doing that so that virtual tabletops can grab them for tokens, right? But still, it's fun to go like, and you see this guy, showing up the art from the
Right.
if you're around the table holding up the book, right? Um, so that's all gets illustrated, and then we sort of make sure that there's a budget that needs to be taken care of, and so only so many pieces of art can get ordered, and sometimes you're
Mhm.
gonna have to be like, oh no, I've got this encounter has like actually like 3 different types of stat blocks in it, and I can't illustrate all 3 different creatures or people or whatever. So I just do the main one, do the most important one,
Yeah.
and then you'd be like, when we're doing pawns, big, you probably have to order art for the other 2 later on, but c'est la vie. Um, Mm. So, yeah, once I sort of plan that out, I count, an adventure for me is about 16 pieces of art ish. If there's lots of smaller ones. And that's sort of also what we sort of guesstimate for word count to fit on a page of 36, 35 pages or something like that. And so spacing me out with like, a half pager every for about 4 of those, one at the end, one at the beginning, blah 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 blah. The NPCs that you're fighting and whatnot. And that generally works out pretty well. Sometimes you get to a point where you are sort of also putting when you're putting new monsters in the thing, those are illustrated in the back of the book,
Mm.
right? In
Mhm.
the Alien Archive. So you don't necessarily need to illustrate them in the adventure. And sometimes an adventure gets so full of those that you run out of things to illustrate in the adventure. I've run across that every once in a while. Or there's just big swaths of space where you're not actually, necessarily having a fight. It's in a exploration or a dungeon crawl that's mostly traps or something like that. Um, it gets tricky sometimes. To that, and that's why we'll see it happens. after, push comes to shove and layout happens, spreads that don't have any art on them whatsoever. Yeah, it happens.
Right. Yeah, so you've done the art, it's gone through the editor,
Mm-hmm.
they've made their pass, then it goes to layout?
Yeah, it'll probably be a couple editing passes at that point. Maybe
Mhm,
one, you know what? Probably one, and then it gets laid out, and then developer needs to make sure it all fits on the page. Good.
mhm.
Uh, this is the point where sometimes terrible sacrifices need to be made because an adventure is too long, or feverishly writing to fill an adventure because it was too short, or figuring out what to do. I forget this is like 2 pages too short. Oh, but the guest here is actually 2 pages over. That's always a happy thing, right? Oh, we'll just give that to you, whatever. Or like, oh, this is so long, we have to cut two monsters, unfortunately, right in the back. Or something else needs to get cut somewhere else. So that's the horse trading that needs to get done with layout and your own sort of inner demons. Um, uh, I kind of enjoyed copy fitting, to be perfectly honest. A lot of people find it very frustrating or time consuming. I always thought that I did a good, quick job of just sort of figuring out where things can go. Just sort of bumping. Oh, this is going to come to the bottom of the column. Bump that up. Boop boop boop. And then mostly for adding stuff. Didn't have too many adventures that were that much over. That huge swaths would need to get cut. I think actually though the first Horizons of the Vast Volume ended up being a little long because of all the extra stuff we had to put in
Right,
for the
right.
re-explaining exploration, basically.
Mhm, mhm.
Once that's been laid out, it goes back to editors. And that'll get hopefully one or two passes at that point. And the editors are going to, at least at Paizo, when they make their changes in the document, that might mess up the copy fit, and it's up to them to sort of adjust it back with help from the developers. Because sometimes if it ends up being a huge thing that we need to cut this or we need to add more stuff, help us. The developer needs to know about that. And once it's been edited again, it gets sort of put into a PDF format for you to look at, for everyone to kind of glance through it as Eric gets another final approval at it before it gets sent off to the printer. And then you're kind of done.
Mhm.
It gets sent off to the printer. You can breathe a sigh of relief. Maybe take a look at the printer proofs when they come in. But for the most part, um, you're just now have to sit on it until it gets announced, right? And then you can talk
Mhm.
about it online, which is always the longest. Or you can tell the authors now you can talk about it online
Right.
because that's always the longest wait to after you've, especially as an author, after you've turned something in until you can actually tell people that you've written something, or basically. So there's some things in there too, a little bit that's about like writing things like the text that goes on the website or the product
Mhm,
page, maybe writing a blog, going on to a podcast and talking about it once it's been announced. You know,
mhm.
That's not really part of the development process per se, but it's just sort of the extra little bits and bobs here and there that occur.
Right. You didn't talk about maps. You mentioned
Mm.
art,
Yeah, that's a good
and
point.
one of the things I've run into in earlier APs especially was these, each square is 10 feet kind of thing, and the maps then are just massive if you were to put them out. Um,
Yeah,
so couple things, I see now on some of the newer volumes, you'll have multiple maps all on one page, like all little different sections,
yeah,
and, it doesn't seem like there's ever use of, the Starfinder maps already created, it's all custom maps. Can you speak to those kind
yes.
of
I mean, it is tricky to because those maps are made without the thought about what they would, without the specific thought of the specific adventures, right? You don't know.
Mhm,
You could say, I think it's fine to say like, oh, hey, look, there's a flip mat hospital, right? Because there's flip mat hospital, for instance. If you set your thing in a hospital, but the needs of the adventure might be that there is a secret room in this hospital. That flip mat is not going to show that secret room in the right place or at all, possibly. So that's why you got to kind of create a custom hospital map at that point.
mhm, mhm,
So it's a balancing act because there's only so much room for maps, only so much budget for maps, and what you depict versus what you don't, for a fight that basically happens on an open field doesn't really need a custom map, in my opinion, because there's nothing really to illustrate. That being said, sort of thing you might want to think about why that encounter is taking place in such a boring location, and spice it up in some way so there does get a map. And maps are tricky. I gotta say, it's tough to. They're tough. You know, not everyone has the artistic chops to draw them out to that we can give to a cartographer to turn them into nice things. And even some and developers have to redo them or whatever, but uh, that's just the way it is. And it was always sort of tricky to come up with like why get so specifics about every little thing. Um, I lost my train of thought there a little bit. Maps, they're tough. That's all I kind of have to
Right.
say about it in a way, right?
So, but authors
Mm.
will generate the map then, and the
Yes.
developer has to make sure it's sufficient for the art to be made for
Yes, and sort of basically label it up maybe here and there, or
it. Mhm.
include a separate description. This is a map of a hospital, and it should look like this, even though this is just a bunch of boxes essentially on the map. Because I don't think we need to be too detailed on our sketches to give to the cartographers. That's what the cartographers are
Mhm.
best at, and what we pay them for is to sort of
Right.
make it look great. But they need to know what shape of everything is and what generally what's going on. And then if you just give them a bunch of boxes, they don't know what that is, and it's just going to come back to you a bunch of boxes that's people are going to look at. So you just got to tell them this is a hospital. It's got gurneys on this part, and this hallway is full. Maybe there's a blood splatter here or something fun like that.
Mhm.
That kind of stuff.
Alright. So now with the changes to the APs where you have, one developer who's doing the whole main part and the back matter, and it's one author doing all that too for a book?
Not necessarily, no. Not
Okay.
for Starfinder. Sometimes I think Pathfinder's still doing that,
Right.
here and there. But not everything. Maybe there's some it's just most of it. But for Starfinder, I sort of because APs were, and I think they still should be, a chance to have the ability to show chance to try out new authors on very small
Mhm.
things, like two monsters. The Codex of Worlds. It's 500 words. Let me see what you
Mhm.
got. And so having one author write everything all the time, I think just sort of boxes out some of your
Right.
newer
Right.
authors, giving them the chance to write some stuff and then build up. Because there's other books, obviously we have hardcovers and other things, and people can write a chunk of 2,000 words or whatever in that. But in a way, um, the Adventure Path developers, if they're different people, which they generally are,
Right.
aren't going to get to see those authors, and they're just going to be giving it to these larger known quantities, and then you're going to burn those people out because you only have so many of them, and they're not going to be able to take it, and um, then you're out of luck, So
Mhm. Mhm.
I think it's behooves us. It behooves Paizo to give everyone a little chance, and then be like, oh yeah, now write something slightly longer that's also an adventure path. Great, you've done that. Now write me an adventure path because I think you're ready.
And the total, word count for the full book in an adventure path is how many? How many words?
I don't remember that number. It's been a while. That has been that long. It's been like a couple months, but I want to say for an adventure, it's something like 25,000 words. Sounds about right. I've got my eyes closed, so I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe plus or minus a couple thousand for other stuff.
Right. Yeah, my take on it, I thought there were about 30,000 words, having talked to
Yes,
a couple other authors, so that
right.
kinda jives
It
with that.
maybe it's somewhere around those. It's between 25
Right.
and 30 something.
Yeah.
The Pathfinder ones are much longer, obviously,
Right, right,
because they're
right.
bigger books.
And then in terms of, 3 book and 6 book
Mm,
adventure paths,
yeah.
so what's the system for alternating that, or is there one even?
There's a little bit of project management, I would say, scheduling involved. So, I'll tell you what happened. Dead Sons started, and it was a six part adventure path because that's what adventure paths were. Then they were always 6 parts. But it was scheduled to come out every other month, right? Because Starfinder was a very small team, and some of the people coming from that team had just come from doing lots and lots of 6-part adventures on a monthly basis, and that can be a very difficult schedule. Um, so we were like, we'll just do, well, it was agreed somewhere around the lines that they'll be every other month. About halfway through that, it was like people out there were clamoring. We need more content. We want more Starfinder. We love Starfinder. We're like, oh, they love
Mhm.
Starfinder. The rulebook's selling out, and the first volume of the Dead Sons is selling out. So it was agreed that we go to monthly for that. As a compromise, for some reason, we thought this would be easier. It would be the one right after Dead Sons would be a 3-parter, and then we do another 3-parter after that, and then we'd sort of see
Right.
how we were doing. Maybe do a 6-parter and whatever. So that's why it happened in the first place. Let's test this out. Starfinder can experiment on this. It'll be I'm not sure why we thought this, but it would be easier for someone to sort of do this 3-parter and then someone else to do the next 3-parter. Now I ended up developing both of those 3-parters,
Mhm.
so it wasn't exactly easier, and it is and it isn't. There's considerations on. It's a little easier to sometimes to tell a full coherent story in 3 parts without any kind of wheel spinning. However, uh, it is extra work to think of 2 different ideas for 3-parters that occur in the same spaces.
Right.
I just want a X. I want this, space truckers. That way, I got 6 volumes for that, and you got to come up with what happens in the middle. That middle part is always the trickiest part for a 6-parter.
Right.
3-parter is pretty easy. You do a thing. The middle, 3-act structure is classic for it plays
Mhm.
in cinemas and stuff and movies and stuff, right? So beginning we introduce the problem, middle we have a little bit of a setback, third part we solve the problem. 6-part you got you could, if you think about the way that the Iron Gods is kind of laid out, is that the first 2 volumes are kind of part one, the next 2 are part two, in a 3-act structure. That's how that one actually
Right.
plays out that way. Um, and so yeah, that's what happened. And so now it just sort of comes down to, I think, honestly, um, because then we started putting them out monthly, putting out 6 volumes, with ton of content. It got to be too much. It was too much content. The people weren't playing through through an entire 6-volume AP. So we decided to sort of like do some more 3-volume stuff. That's where sort of Devastation art comes in. And we could, one point, I think we did a 3-volume so that it would offset from the Pathfinder schedule, so that the
Mm.
first volume of an AP of Pathfinder would occur on this quarter, business quarter, and then the first volume of a new Starfinder Adventure Path would occur in this quarter. So we could, space out the marketing and not, cannibalize our own business. But I think then we went to do the standalone modules. We cut back to every other month for the
Right.
adventure paths. And I personally think that the 3-volume adventure paths are the way to go. They're tighter.
Mhm.
They're more focused. And I wouldn't say they're easier, but you're in and you're out. It's basically how it goes. And they're achievable for
Right.
more groups in terms of playing them all the way through, and people will hopefully buy them all.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of groups have difficulty getting all the way through a 6-part AP.
Yeah.
I think the 3-parter makes a lot of sense in that.
Yeah.
Well, Jason, this has been great tapping into all this past experience you had as a senior
Yeah.
Starfinder developer and doing these things. It's been a lot of fun, but we are at our time.
Yeah, well, I've been yammering on for long enough. So thanks for listening to me, John. And thanks for
Oh,
everyone out there to also listening to me just talk.
I'm John.
And I'm Jason, and this has been Digital Divination.